Boys and girls, I don't know what happened to Seesaw, but it will not let me record a video. So this will work. All you have to do is close your eyes and listen anyways. I'll try and show you the pictures when they come up, but I can't read sideways, so. This is the sailor's hornpipe. I don't know who is sick in bed. I don't know who is having a good time dancing. We'll find out. The Moffats all went to Mrs. Chichester's dancing school in Moose Hall. They didn't have to pay Miss Chichester a penny for their lessons. Mamma did a great deal of sewing for Miss Chichester, and she was not always able to settle her bills with Mamma. Mamma said they should strike a bargain. The way Miss Chichester might settle her bills was to give all the Moffats dancing lessons free, or rather, all except Rufus. Rufus would go as soon as he was a little older. Although, for that matter, as far as age went, he really could go now. Hughie Pudge was in the dancing class, and he was only 6, just a few months older than Rufus, but he and Rufus always got into a dispute, which ended in a big fight. Or else they spent the time firing spitballs from their slingshots at the moose heads at each end of the hall. Naturally, these doings upset the class. One or the other, therefore, must be kept out. Since Rufus did not pay for his lessons and Hughie did, of course Rufus was the one Miss Chichester felt she would have to get along without. Rufus did not mind in the least being deprived of dancing lessons. He much preferred playing marbles or riding his scooter. Of the 3 Moffats, Sylvie, Joe, and Jane, who did go to Miss Chichester's dancing school, Sylvie was the only one who loved it wholeheartedly. She was very quick and graceful. Dancing came as naturally to her as breathing. It was no wonder Miss Chichester made her do half the teaching. As for Jane, she loved the thought of dancing school. But when she got there, how different it always was from what she had imagined. Before going to sleep at night, Jane pictured herself dancing as beautifully and gracefully as Sylvie. Now she would have the center of the floor at dancing school, spinning lightly as a leaf while all the others held their breath. Or she would be leading the Virginia reel with the greatest of ease and assurance. Her arms and legs would behave perfectly. But in real life, her arms and legs acted as though they were stuffed with lead, and her hands and feet seemed to swell to extraordinary proportions. Moreover, on dancing school days, Mamma always did her hair up in curlers instead of her 2 familiar pigtails. Strange long curls bobbed behind her, distracting her attention. They looked absolutely ridiculous, she was sure. Corkscrews, Peter Frost called them. As far as she was concerned, the only really nice thing about dancing school was the slippers with the pom-poms on their toes and the ribbon lacings that wound halfway up her white-stockinged legs. Even though she never could dance at dancing school the way she could in her dreams, the slippers alone made it worthwhile. But Joe hated dancing school and didn't have even the consolation of pom-poms on his slippers. He hated dancing school, and he was no good at it. He was good at lots of other things. He was good at spinning tops. He could fly kites better than anybody else on the block. He always had a good pencil with a fine, sharp point in his pocket. He could whistle, and he could whittle. Yes, all these things he was good at, but he was not good at dancing school, and he did not like it, not at all. He begged Mamma not to make him go. "I'll rake the leaves, shovel the snow, mow the lawn, sift the ashes, without your ever even asking me to," he said to Mamma. But Mamma said he should go. If he didn't go, Miss Chichester would feel very badly. She would feel as though she were not keeping her part of the bargain. "But I think I feel worse going to dancing school than Miss Chichester would if I didn't go," Joe said miserably. He knew, though, that remonstrance was useless. I don't know what that means, boys and girls. Remonstrance. I'm sure it means arguing or complaining. Mama knew he didn't like parties, dancing school, speaking pieces. Still, she thought he should do these things. You must learn to be graceful and to have nice manners, even though you are a boy, she said. To Mama, this business exchange of dancing for sewing seemed a heaven-sent opportunity. How otherwise could she possibly afford to give her children the advantages of dancing school? Under the circumstances, she thought Joe should go. Try to like it, she pleaded with him. Well, since it seemed so important to Mama, Joe went. But he often hid behind the piano at dancing school, particularly during the Tom Joneses and the Virginia Reels, which he never could do without getting mixed up. Sometimes, if luck were with him, he was able to pass nearly the whole half hour behind the piano very pleasantly indeed, with an apple or a book. And he would not have to listen to Miss Chichester call to Miss Nippen and tell her to repeat, "Shine, little glowworm, glimmer, glimmer," because he, Joe, had gotten himself and his partner and most of his immediate neighbors hopelessly out of step. Joe always woke up in the morning of those dancing school days with a funny feeling in the pit of his stomach. What was it? He'd lie there in bed for a minute or two. Here's a good picture. Wondering. He'd done his geography and his spelling, and he'd even gone ahead a chapter in history. Then he'd remember, "Oh, of course," he'd sigh. "It's dancing school today." And the worst day of all for him was the one when Miss Chichester gave her recital. He hadn't expected the day to be bad at all. In fact, he'd expected this day to be easier to endure than the ordinary dancing school days, because Miss Chichester had said to him, "All you will have to do, Joe, is to usher the guests into their seats. I'll help you see that the important people have the best seats in the front row. After that, you can turn pages for Miss Nippen." This is Miss Nippen. She's a piano player, so he's going to make sure she can turn the pages so she doesn't have to skip a note. So that was the plan. Joe must stand by the piano. Oh, it's telling you. Hair brushed neatly aside, toes out, and in his best Sunday suit of dark brown corduroy. Whenever Mrs. Nippen whispered, "Turn," he was to turn the page of her music. This seemed rather silly to Joe. Miss Nippen appeared perfectly capable of turning her music for herself every other day. In fact, the entire class had learned to pause, sometimes with one foot suspended in the air, while Miss Nippen fumbled with the pages. Why put on these lugs? However, all this was far more to his taste than to dance the sailor's hornpipe. Phew! That is what he was first scheduled to do, dance the sailor's hornpipe. But he had such difficulty learning the steps that Miss Chichester finally said that Chet Pudge would have to do it instead. Even though Chet was very fat and grew very red in the face and puffy, he would have to dance the sailor's hornpipe. And indeed, Joe could do the ushering and turning of the pages and get 10 cents besides if all turned out well. So, is it any wonder that Joe looked forward to the day of the recital as one dancing school day, anyway, when he would be free of all care and worry? And he watched Jane and Sylvie practice their dances around the house with an air of compassion. Joe may have been carefree about the recital, but Jane wasn't. She had to dance to a Wild Rose. And Letitia Murdoch? How would they carry it off, she wondered. She, Jane, did it pretty well all by herself in the lilac brush. But when she and Letitia stood up there in Moose Hall before all those people, how would it go then? So far, in all the rehearsals, she and Letitia finished the dance long before Miss Nippen finished the music. That was not right. Dance and music were supposed to end at the same moment. And she worried about her hair, too. There was no chance of Mama letting her wear her everyday braids. No recital was a special occasion. No, a recital was a special occasion and would require curls. If it rained, the curls would come out. Jane prayed for a clear sunny day for the recital. She said all the charms she knew to avert rain and prayed to God to send a clear day. Rufus generally did the same as a favor to her, though it made no difference to him. In spite of all this, it did rain. This was a miserable start for the day. It meant that Jane's hair, which had been done up in curlers during the night, turned into long, damp strings. She arrived at Moose Hall in a very low frame of mind. Better pigtails than these slinky things, she reflected bitterly as she examined herself critically in the dressing-room mirror. Sylvie tried to comfort her. I'll brush them around my finger just before you go in. But they both knew it was really a hopeless undertaking. Sylvie helped Jane into her costume. It was a white cheesecloth dress with wreaths of large red roses around its neck and waist. While she was dressing, Letitia arrived with her hair still in curlers. Imagine coming through the streets with wiggles in your hair, marveled Jane. Letitia put on her white cheesecloth dress. Then she sat down before the mirror, and Jane watched her unwind the curlers with expert fingers. The curls came out in long yellow pipes. Jane wondered if Letitia felt jumpy inside, the way she did when she thought about Too Wild a Rose. As if in answer to her thoughts, Letitia announced calmly, I may be sick. Now? Asked Jane aghast. Might, any time. Even when we're doing the grand parade? Might. Even when we're doing Too Wild a Rose? Might. Jane swallowed hard and wound one of her straggling locks around her finger in pensive silence. Letitia added nothing to this thunderbolt, merely sniffing now and again, touching her nose delicately with her scented pocket handkerchief. At this moment, Miss Chichester rushed in a very flurried manner. She said, Ready now for the grand parade? Jane swiftly glanced at Letitia in a sudden panic lest she would have to do To a Wild Rose all by herself. But Letitia looked calm and resigned. Sylvie ran the hairbrush hastily over Jane's hair for the last time. She set the wreath of large red roses on top of Jane's head. There, she said, you look lovely. Where's your partner? Hurry for the grand parade. Sylvie wasn't dancing this afternoon. Her class of older pupils was performing in the evening. A very elegant affair, said Jane loftily to Letitia as they joined the procession that marched around the hall. There was Joe by the piano, looking carefree and happy. He had seated the audience, and so far as he knew, he had made no serious mistakes. To be sure, when Mrs. Mulligan, the wife of the chief of police, arrived with her little dog, Sugar, he had placed them in the front row with the important guests. Miss Chichester had not liked this arrangement at all, supposing that Sugar causes a commotion. Mrs. Mulligan should be sitting near the door. Well, it's too late now. Let her stay where she is. Joe was thinking if he did as well turning pages as he had ushering, that 10 cents was clinched. So there he was now, turning the pages for Miss Nippin's music as she pounded on the grand parade march with verve and vigor. That is, he was turning every time Miss Nippin remembered to say turn. She wasn't used to having a turner, and often tried to flip the pages over herself. We'd ought to have a rehearsal, thought Joe gloomily, but maybe she'll get used to having me here after a while. He certainly hoped she wouldn't endanger his 10 cents with her forgetfulness. He considered confiding in Miss Nippin, telling her he had much at stake. However, all thought of that 10 cents suddenly vanished. All in a second, things changed. From a happy, carefree boy, Joe became in a moment the most morose and melancholy of creatures. It happened while Jane and Letitia were marching past him. He was making a face at them. Jane was hissing something to him that sounded like, "She may be sick." But what she was talking about, or who might be sick, he neither knew nor cared. He himself felt sick in another second, for Miss Chichester had appeared very suddenly and said, without so much as a word of warning, "Joe, you'll have to do the sailor's hornpipe after all. That Chet Pudge has never shown up." Well, after this, Joe hardly ever heard Miss Nippen say turn. Sometimes he did and hastily flipped the pages over, but most of the time he was too miserable to hear anything. He couldn't do the sailor's hornpipe. Miss Chichester herself admitted that, after giving him 3 hours' private instruction one day. Had she forgotten? Miss Nipton now was getting very annoyed with Joe. She would hiss, "Turn!" but her turner was just standing by with glazed eyes. This made her music terribly jerky, as she paused on the bottom of each page and waited for him to turn. Things could not go on this way. She became so agitated, her eyeglasses fell off. Sometimes they both grabbed for the page and fumbled dreadfully, or else neither one of them thought to turn it. Miss Nippen counting on Joe, and Joe thinking gloomily of the sailor's hornpipe. He tried to recall some of the steps. How did the old thing go? It was weeks since he had given it a thought. Now all he could remember of it was that you slapped your thighs and stamped your feet. And all the while Miss Nippen was getting more and more fidgety. At the end of this number, she hissed in a voice calculated to fetch anyone up short, "You pay attention, young man. You're boggling the music." The next dance on the program was "To a Wild Rose." As Jane and Letitia passed Joe to take their place in the center of the floor, Jane hissed again to Joe, "She said she might be sick, but she hasn't been yet." This temporarily distracted Joe's mind from the sailor's hornpipe. He watched Jane, and Letitia in particular, with expectant curiosity. Miss Chichester came over and stood by the piano. From time to time she made remarks under her breath about the dancers. "Adequate," she murmured. "Hardly a finished performance, however. There. I knew that Jane would forget to make that turn. Now, Letitia's off the wrong foot. End it quickly, Miss Tipton, and start the clapping." The 2 wild roses bowed and rushed more thankfully than gracefully from the floor. Then Miss Chichester said, "Now is your turn, Joe." She turned to address the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, in the absence of Chester Pudge, who, as you see from the program, was to perform the sailor's hornpipe in his own fashion, his grandfather was a sea captain, so he comes by it naturally. In the absence, then, of Chester Pudge, Master Joseph Moffat has very kindly offered to do this dance. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I give you Joseph Moffat in the sailor's hornpipe." Joe gulped in his breath and said to himself, "Wait till I get that Chet Pudge." He stumbled over his heavy boot strings and wished his corduroy trousers did not squeak so as he marched to the middle of the hall. He had hated to leave that nice safe place by the piano. "Mercy on us!" he heard Miss Chichester gasp as he stalked past her. "I didn't know he had those heavy boots on. I thought of course he'd be wearing his dancing shoes." One pair of shoes was as good as another to Joe when it came to sailors' hornpipes, but he was furious with himself. To think the shoes he had on might have served as a good excuse for not doing the dance, and he hadn't thought of it. Too late now, however. On with the sailor's hornpipe. Miss Nipton started the lively tune, and Joe started to shuffle his feet. He could see it was going to be far worse than he had expected even. Stamp, 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 slap, slap. That's all he could remember. A great deal of stamping and slapping. His boots made a terrific clatter, and his trousers kept up that whistling and squeaking. He had never felt more foolish and miserable in his whole life. He could hardly hear the music, Miss Chichester kept time by clapping her hands very hard and nodding her head back and forth so that the hairpins flew. Miss Nippin kept along beautifully without a turner and just pounded the music out. They all seemed to think the more noise they made, the better he could dance. Stamp, stamp, slap, slap. He kicked his legs and slapped his thighs. What next, he wondered? Was this going on forever? But what was this? Sugar, Miss Mulligan's Sugar, who had slept peacefully in her lap through such dances as A Daisy Do to a Wild Rose and Nellie Take a Kiss. Do you guys see it? Suddenly sat bolt upright. Every nerve in his taut little body was alive and vibrant. He uttered a joyful yelp and bounded from Miss Mulligan's lap to the center of the floor where Joe was performing. He stood up on his hind legs, bowed, stamped, shuffled, and turned this way and that. Anyone could see he was dancing as perfect a sailor's hornpipe as a small, furry dog possibly could. Hooray, hooray, shouted the audience as soon as it had recovered from its first bewildered surprise. Joe was so startled by the new development that he paused, hoping this was to be deliverance from this miserable dance. Then he realized that the dog, Sugar, was doing the sailor's hornpipe and was looking to him for cues. Gee, what a smart dog, thought Joe enthusiastically, and took up the steps again. Bow and kick, shuffle and stamp. The two got on together with perfect understanding. Bravo! Bravo! Hooray for Joseph Moffat! And hooray for Sugar! Storms of applause rocked the hall. Again, again, the people yelled, Encore! The enthusiasm was so great that Joe and the dog just had to repeat the dance. Joe didn't mind it a bit the second time. The people are probably looking at him, not at me, he thought, almost enjoying himself now. Finally, the music ceased. Sugar gracefully bowed his head several times and then returned to Mrs. Mulligan, walking all the way on his hind feet. Joe bowed too, and retreated hastily to his place by the piano, amid rousing shouts of applause. Hooray, hooray for Joe Moffat and the dog! Hooray for the sailor's hornpipe! The audience screamed again. Joe scrunched his program up in his pocket and wished they'd all stop yelling and clapping. He certainly wished he could get behind the piano, but of course that was impossible with everyone staring so. Besides, there were still 1 or 2 dances on the program, and he supposed he'd have to resume his job as turner if he wanted that 10 cents. As for Sugar, he climbed right back on Miss Mulligan's lap. He was panting and his tongue hung out of his mouth. Miss Mulligan petted him and said, Good doggie, smart doggie. Where did you learn those tricks, sir? For no one in the audience, not even Miss Mulligan, knew what had prompted that dance. No one knew that years before he had become Miss Mulligan's lapdog, he had belonged to a young sailor, to a friend of the chief of police. The sailor had taught Sugar, not Sugar then, but Tar, to dance the sailor's hornpipe, while he too danced and played the harmonica. Well, Sugar hadn't heard that tune in years, and this afternoon when he did hear it, what was he thinking? A hall filled with party-dressed ladies and children clad in fancy costumes? Not at all. But a rolling deck, a young sailor named Jack, and the taste of salt in the air. Was that why he was licking his whiskers when he settled down once more in Miss Mulligan's lap? When all the dances were finished, Mrs. Nippin struck up the grand parade march again, and everyone filed out. Joe waited at the piano, turned until the last chord was played. Then he helped Mrs. Chichester close up the hall. As they parted, she said, Thank you, Joe, for your impromptu performance. You made a success of the recital. Everyone says you were the best part of the program. You certainly were the hit of the day. And she gave him a friendly nod as she put up her umbrella. But she forgot his 10 cents, and Joe was too shy to ask for it. He pulled down his cap, jerked up his coat collar, stuck his hands in his pockets, and walked home in the rain, whistling.